Hello and welcome to another episode of My Pocket Psych, the podcast all about the psychology of the workplace. I'm Dr. Richard McKinnon, chartered psychologist and coach, and this week I'm joined by a new guest, a new face on the podcast, Professor Antonina Pereira. It's great to have you here today. How are you doing?
I'm really well. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh no, thanks for making the time for this. As with all our guests, it's my pleasure to bring expertise onto the show. So thank you. So let me start an introduction. I'll share a little bit about you, and then I'd love if you could share a little bit more with our listeners and our viewers. You're the director at the Institute of Psychology, Business and Human Sciences at the University of Chichester. And that's where you're also professor in neuropsychology and neuroscience. Is that correct so far?
And that's absolutely correct. Yes. And
fantastic. Well, look, would you like to tell us a little bit more about you, your career to date, and your research before we get into the detail?
Of course, I'd love to. At the Institute, I really have the pleasure of working with colleagues that are fantastic and really interested about very diverse areas that go from psychology to business, to humanistic counseling, to accounting and finance, to criminology. So really a vast, vast range of areas. But they are all united by this, I think, sense of wanting to understand a little bit more about what is this thing being human, and how is it that we interact with each other? How is it that we develop together? And because of that, I feel that everyone is really interested in understanding each other as well. And we do often use the word family, which is really rare in higher education and has some strong connotations for some people.
I was going to say, yeah.
But nothing makes me happier than seeing my colleagues develop, thrive. I'm an educator at heart, as well as being a neuropsychologist. And I love that. I love doing it with the students, watching them go from point A to point B, looking at them at graduation, crossing that stage and thinking, wow, that was all the work that we've invested. Look where they are now. But at the same time, doing the same with colleagues and watching them sometimes having started with us at undergraduate level and then progressing, master's, PhD. Oh, look, they started teaching and now they're associate lecturers, senior lecturers, readers, professors. It's incredible. It's to witness careers developing. That really makes my heart tick.
That really does sound lovely. And it's a great example, isn't it, of values and human needs in action, what we get from our work, which is what this podcast is all about. Tell us a little bit more about your specialism. What is it that you research? And then we'll look at how it's relevant to our listeners.
I'm really, really interested in prospective memory. So memory for future events. For example, remembering on your way home that you need to stop by the supermarket because you need to buy a pint of milk. And sometimes it's only the following day when you open the door of the fridge that you think, oh, it was the milk. Or like me, even if you use strategy, I'm very poor at prospective memory. So last night, I set up an alarm, as I always do, to charge my electric vehicle. And it has to be at after 10 p.m. because that's when the electricity tariffs are more convenient. And then, of course, the phone rings, but something else was happening. So it was actually my husband's 51st birthday. So we were quite distracted with celebrations, and I completely forgot. And this morning, oh no, here I have to charge the vehicle again. And these things are quite frequent in everyday life because we are involved in so many activities and doing so many things at the same time. And so it's difficult sometimes to remember if you want.
Absolutely. When I first heard that this was what your research was focused on, I got very excited because a little bit like that, I have to use so many strategies, which we'll come back to get even the simplest things done. And there are many ways we can do that. But I know that from my work that I do with coachees and training courses that I run under the loose title productivity, that setting those intentions and making sure important things get done, it's one of the biggest problems people face. And there's a number of reasons why that might be. From your perspective, why is it such an important facet of our memory?
Because it really underpins the activity that you need to perform. So it's really essential, for example, for an autonomous life, an independent life. And so in the lab, we see a huge difference in prospective memory very early in the neurodegenerative process for people who might at some point develop Alzheimer's.
Mm.
And that's quite interesting because it comes earlier than more traditional measures of retrospective memory. So memory for past events or names or... but interestingly, it's also presented as a greater cause for concern. I think that carers, sisters, brothers, parents, children, they do not worry if their loved one forgot the name of a cat or forgot the name or something happened. But they do worry quite a bit if people forget to turn off the oven,
Yeah.
or if people leave the water open, and it becomes something that happens and interferes with everyday life. So it's really quite prevalent. It's everywhere. And there are many contexts where prospective memory is present, and it can be quite crucial and life-threatening sometimes. That is the reality. And it's really important that we identify mechanisms that allow us to perform prospective memory tasks in a way that is more effective and that is not that does not load so much, if you want, on our working memory and other components of everyday life.
So it's so interesting, that distinction that I'm hearing between the retrospective and the prospective, in that, is it as crucial if we forget a date in the past? What year was that? What's your favorite color? Or even in the workplace, what month did we agree that? A lot of the time that stuff is outsourced in a way, and we could find it if we really needed to. What I'm hearing from your description is the consequences of a lapse in prospective memory. I forget to do a thing. What are the consequences of me not doing that thing? And the really strong message there is it could be something hugely important with huge
Indeed.
consequences. So I'm thinking of people who are sitting in an office and they get reminders constantly to dial into their next meeting. It's almost a matter, 10 minutes till your next call, 10 minutes to your next call. But there's lots of other things that they don't get reminded about that are maybe, unusual or not very frequent in their schedule, that are so easy to forget. And as your case indicated, people could judge them for that. Why didn't you remember that important thing? So it's not a human failing as such. It's more about how our memory works.
It truly is. And there is a clear distinction also within prospective memory between time-based prospective memory and event-based prospective memory. And for the time-based tasks, it's easier to find sources of support, as you've identified. We're reminded on mechanisms through the internet that, there's a meeting coming, or I can use a timer on my mobile phone to tell me to charge my car at 10. And yes, such as in this example, they can still mistakes can still happen.
Yeah.
But it's easier to mitigate, and the frequency of those mistakes is not as high as it will be for event-based prospective memory. So upon something happening, you have to do something else. For example, when you see your friend Helen, don't forget to tell her to, phone home or something that has to happen upon a cue, if you want, from the environment. So in the example of driving by the supermarket, the cue would be, there's a supermarket. I must remember to pull over and to go in and buy that milk and come back. But if that millisecond of a moment where you're running by that, if you forget that was your intention, then it does not happen. And also the reasons behind that event not happening might be quite complex. And yes, in very, very pressurized environments, we do think that it has to do with the fact that we are performing a multiplicity of activities. It's quite frequent, for example, in the scenario of surgeries, for medical doctors to now have a list
Yes.
of identified objects, and it's the number of tissues used. If you're wearing a bobby pin, everything has to be identified, and making sure that nothing is left at random, and that you don't forget something that might have been inserted in a patient
consequences.
temporarily.
Yeah, but this is a point I often make in my training, that the use of checklists is actually being professional. It's not amateur hour, because you're increasing the chance of you doing the thing properly and not leaving something out. You're not overloading your attention with having to remember 20 things in the right sequence or 50 things at all. And a lot of people push back on that because they view a checklist as somehow cheating. So I always use the example of surgeons and pilots who use checklists, because the consequences are so dramatic if they leave something out or do it in the wrong order.
Could not agree more. Checklists can be quite useful and also therapeutic even, because then the cancellation of an activity, which is something quite important for prospective memory, again for patients, and not just only Alzheimer patients, but frontotemporal dementia and vascular dementia as well. There is a high incidence of what we call commission errors. Commission errors occur when you forgot to cancel an intention and do it again. So, for example, with medication, did I take this? Oh, I don't remember. I'll take another one just for good measure. Oh, did I take that medication? I can no longer remember. Oh, and there we go, 3 instead of the 1 that should have been. And easily done. So it's really difficult to cancel an intention. It's really important to cancel it. And if we have an activity, a physical activity that invites that cancellation, such as crossing one of the items in a checklist, that's in a sense fulfilling. That's what I mean by when I say therapeutic, because it can really help. Oh, this is done. I've achieved this. I can, or it's no longer valid. It's no longer necessary.
Exactly.
But whatever the reason is, it's a reduction on the things that are occupying your working memory and that can cause so much damage as well. It's creating that space. Using skillful techniques. I agree that a checklist is a very, very skillful, very useful technique, and that that prevents mistakes in ways that are not always apparent, but very efficient.
Exactly. I always ask in workshops for a show of hands, how many people write something on the list so they can immediately check it off, and everyone's hands go up, because it feels good to have checked something off the list. But for those, the complex things where you've got a lot to remember, I do a lot of work with finance professionals. I've done a lot of work with people who are engineers, where processes need to be followed. And even though it's not danger to people, it's maybe a financial impact on production or the quality. They live by checklists. It's process, because why would you try and remember something like that? Whereas so many other clients feel, I'll carry it around up here. And then they wonder why they feel so busy, so overwhelmed, because they haven't outsourced it to an external tool, like a piece of paper.
I could not agree more. And I think that technology as well offers sometimes solutions that can be quite efficient and conducive to greater productivity. But a checklist is something so simple that you can use and embed in any activity of your life. All you need is a piece of paper, a pen or a pencil, and that's it. And so much can happen when you deposit that intention there for a moment even. That can be at times essential to create the space for an activity to be performed in a more professional manner, in a more efficient manner. And in the same way, occupying memory with things such as phone numbers is not, it's an exercise, but it's not a necessity. And given that we have repositories that allow us so efficiently to retrieve those phone numbers, why is it that we will waste time doing that. Our memory is already so complex, and we can try to memorize things for so long, again and again and again, and we will not succeed. Whereas with other events, for example, with flashbulb memory, the memory of that event does not leave our minds, and it's there permanently in such an intense way that we cannot create the space to just let it go.
Yeah.
And life is complex and hard enough without us creating other barriers.
Absolutely. This is the point I try and hammer home. If you've got tools, and a piece of paper and a pen constitutes tools, that will make things slightly easier. You're using tools to help you. I mean, the creation of written language is one of the most important steps in the evolution of humanity. And yet there's people walking around ignoring written language and making life more difficult for themselves. And I know people at work, regardless of their job, who are listening to this, will be able to think ahead to the remainder of their day and just imagine all of the tasks left to do, because jobs are made up of tasks. And how many of those are routine, habitual? How many of them might be novel, or might be different today, or might be contingent on a person or a place or something else? You can quickly see the real relevance of prospective memory.
Oh, yes. And it's quite interesting because also the relevance of those tasks for the individual, or if you want, the desire to perform those tasks, also influences our capacity to perform them in a timely manner and efficiently. And there's extensive work by Gowitzer, for example, on intentions and goals, and prospective memory in itself fits that perfectly. It is a goal. We're setting an intention to perform an action in the future. And that intention for Gowitzer is usually associated with behaviors that are associated with healthy actions. For example, I want to quit smoking. I want to stop eating so much carbs. I want to. And the setting of that intention is also quite crucial. So what we would call in a lab scenario, the encoding of the action so that we can perform it later is quite crucial. And interestingly, influences behaviors that go all the way up to these very health psychology topics of quitting smoking, or it's quite interesting.
It's really interesting. And I was just thinking now, I didn't forget to make the cup of coffee I wanted when I came back from my lunchtime walk. And that's a simple task, but you know why? I really enjoy my cup of coffee after my lunchtime walk. There was no way I was not going to do that unless something really strange happened, like someone knocked at my door or there was a phone call. The consequences are minor, really, really minor. But if I forgot to dial in for a webinar, or if I forgot to speak to a prospective client at the time they wanted, that's important to me. It's desirable to me. But there's all those little things that come or can come between me and the thing, the distractions, the overload, the just busy mind, loosely speaking, where there's a lot going on. So what could we do? What kind of approaches do you recommend that people could experiment with to minimize these lapses in prospective memory?
It will depend on the type of prospective memory that you'd like to enhance. And again, one of the components has to do with the acceptance of particular tasks. You've mentioned, oh, I really want to have this cup of coffee. That's really, really exciting because there's very, very recent research on what we call the preschool of prospective memory. So very early, young prospective memory creation in children aged around 2. And how is it that you evaluate prospective memory? Because the component of wanting to do that task needs to be really something very, very present in the task design. it's really interesting to see some experiments being designed with children. You must, don't forget, before you leave the room, just pick behind that curtain, there'll be a chocolate there waiting for you. So we manipulate intentions, either chocolate or it could be a fruit, so not as desirable. And we can really see the effect it has on people. Don't forget, before you leave the room, pick there because there'll be an apple waiting for you. Don't think so.
Yeah, chocolate's going to win every time, right?
Yes. Plenty of those at home. But interestingly, there is new research into the development of techniques to enhance prospective memory. I'm particularly interested in enhancing it for patients living with Alzheimer's disease. But some of the techniques that I am developing for patients can be used effectively across the lifespan. And I've conducted studies with healthy younger adults, age 18 to 21, just at university. And it works for them as well. So that's really, really interesting. It works across the lifespan for people at different ages. And it has to do with physical encoding. So at the moment you would like to memorize a particular activity, to physically pretend to do that activity. That's really interesting. And it, of course, does not work for all the activities because there has to be a physical component associated with it, or at least you have to be able to imagine yourself doing this activity. It's quite interesting because we can manipulate different aspects. What we are not quite sure yet is whether any physical activity as performed at the moment where you are encoding or you are making the memory works, or whether it has to be associated. And this is work that I'm beginning to develop. Is it a connection that is created, that is so close, you're really imagining yourself doing the action, and so when the moment comes, you do it? Or is it really just the physical movement in itself?
That's really interesting. So that could be the difference, if I understand you, that could be the difference between someone picking up their phone to imagine making a phone call and saying they want to do that versus something like just tapping the table, which is a behavior. I must remember to do this thing. That's really interesting. It gets me thinking about something that we use in stress management approaches, mental rehearsal and coping. You know, if I mentally rehearse the difficult thing and I imagine myself coping okay with it, that can really help me when I actually have to do the thing. And what you're saying is if I can imagine the behavior, and have some physical behavior with that, that will help me remember to do the thing. That's really interesting.
Creating a deeper connection. But interestingly, we've observed in the lab, again, preliminary studies and research with fMRI. So we need to collect more data, and research with fMRI is quite expensive as well. So we're in the process of developing it and looking for some donors, kind donors that can support this research. But interestingly, and I'm not sure whether you've been in an MRI, but you have to stand very still. It's really quite a daunting experience, I think. You're told, don't move, don't even blink if you can. Oh, no. And now you're there stuck for 2 hours doing this prospective memory study. Oh, no, really don't want to do this.
Yeah, it's not attractive.
But it's very interesting because we have manipulated enactment and have asked people to pretend to perform the action they wanted to perform upon seeing a particular cue. And the cues could be things such as taking out the bins or remembering to return a book to the library. But on the MRI, they were seeing images, and they were doing ongoing tasks that were complex and demanded their attention. And then they would see those particular images where they would have to press a key. Interestingly, even when we asked them to stand still and relax, and they were exposed to those images, we would see an enhanced activation of the caudate and the insula. These are areas that are traditionally associated with the preparation for movement. So even when they were standing very, very still in the MRI, being told, no, don't move anything, but when exposed to the cue, There was something in the brain. We were engaging areas of the brain that we would not normally engage for memory and retrieval or memory production. We're instead engaging areas that are used in the preparation for movement. And this is, if you want, the beginning of brain plasticity. We're asking other areas that are still healthy. And the implications for Alzheimer's patients will be huge if the results continue to replicate. And we've had this with healthy participants so far. So we have to make sure that it continues to replicate with patients. And as the study develops, that is our intention. But it's fascinating because we're asking different areas of the brain that are intact or still very, very healthy to produce new memories, allowing other areas that are no longer functioning in the same manner not to be engaged in that memory retrieval. It's excellent.
It's incredible.
But we hope very, very early stages.
Yeah. But I mean, it underlines the complexity of memory, full stop. And you're underlining the relevance of prospective memory just to everyday functioning, from did I take my vitamins through to did I turn off the heater, did I attend the meeting, or all of those important things. Now, you've talked about encoding those memories, those intentions. What about those strategies that involve outsourcing it somehow and using a tool, using technology? What seems to work there?
And interestingly, reminders that are visual can really work. And so even for event-based, because of course, for time-based tasks, having a mobile phone ringing at the time of the event is quite effective. It's not 100% because you can still be distracted by other things. But for many of the event-based activities, that's not going to happen. So a combination of a visual cue that is strategically located can really help. So I'll go to my example of charging the car again. I usually leave my key inside a little drawer. But when I want to remember to charge it, and I know that the mobile phone won't work because it will ring and then I'll be doing something else, so I'll forget about it. I have a visual cue. I leave the key on top of my table. And because I have that visual cue associated with, okay, it's outside, so that means that I need to charge the car. Let me check, is it 10 o'clock already? Oh yes, I can charge it now. It really works. In parallel, things such as remembering to take a book with you to a particular place, or these are very, very procedural, basic activities, I think, that actually the accumulation of these activities can pose a real burden. And how is it that we mimic that idea of the list in real life using just environmental cues? Can be complex. And the interesting thing is that it will have to be different from person to person and even from patient to patient, because not everything works for everyone in the same way. But I feel that providing examples that are meaningful, that oh yes, I always forget to do that. From now on, I will do this little thing that will really help.
Those point to the power of looking at things through the lens of habits. If we look at tiny atomic levels of behavior, we can manipulate that much easier than I need to remember this 20-step process in one go. That's going to be so overwhelming.
Impossible.
And it will put a dent in our self-efficacy. We won't feel good about that. Whereas you feel better if your little system works for you, like leaving the book at, like leaving the keys at, like the Post-it note on the back of the door.
Yes, very, very effective techniques that can make a huge difference with very, very low impact. And but it will be different for every person. And the interesting thing is that this is associated with what in the literature McDaniel and Einstein have called the bizarreness effect. So, it's odd. Why would a Post-it be there? Let me see what it says. That works so well because it's a Post-it in a very strange place. It doesn't belong there. Immediately, everything in your body will be attracted to that bizarre thing, that thing that is unusual in the environment. And that really helps. So instead of having to carry it, because this is the problem, there are different theories of memory, but there are capacity theories that say, it's limited. And there are other theories around the fact that we can be more pliable, some even that argue that some types of memory can even become automatic.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless of that, there is an understanding that it's not completely illimited. Long-term memory, perhaps, but there's only a modicum of items that we can keep in our memory for enough time to commit it to long-term memory. And it's very interesting because early studies on this area are actually from the 50s. And there are authors that play with the fact that we can memorize around 4 items or 4 chunks of things at once, give or take, plus or minus 2. And that's quite interesting because in reality, we can extend that bottleneck, if you want, by using different techniques that can help us to almost outsource memory.
I mean, that's the phrase I use. And you're taking me back to my undergraduate degree, which I hasten to add was not in the 1950s. But when we did our neuropsych modules, that was the bit that really interested me. Strategies and techniques that can take us beyond what might be viewed as a traditional limitation. And chunking of information is something that maybe people do without realizing they're doing it, like how they remember a phone number, for example.
Yes. And it's quite strategic. Even the way postcodes in the UK, for example, have been designed has to do with the number of items that we can memorize. And it's a perfect combination. But for phone numbers, we will even sing a little song, 074-926-18760. That's not my phone number, by the way.
I'm glad you made that clear. So this is really interesting because, you know, memory is part of being a human, and everyone will have experience of both effectively using that prospective memory and noticing the lapse, you know, the disappointment through to what feels like a disaster on the day. But in broad terms, if we're mindful about it, we can remind ourselves by using objects, by using technology, by using lists, and possibly, and I don't know to what extent this sits in the literature, but being a bit compassionate towards ourselves as well. It's not possible to remember everything. Why wouldn't you make it easier for yourself?
Absolutely. That is so important. As with everything else, that sense of understanding that we are not infallible really helps performance. And I think that people who like to see themselves as really high achievers and high performers sometimes have a difficulty in accepting the fact that actually it's quite complex and you cannot do everything all the time. You cannot be everything for everyone. And in memory, that really, really applies. It's quite interesting, for example, that stimuli that are competing for the same resources cannot be performed really well at the same time. And that has been studied extensively and in the literature, but actually for memory, and more recently, Cowan, who since 2010, more or less, has been exploring how is it that we manipulate this a little bit. And because it's quite clear that if, for example, I am writing something and listening to a music with lyrics, I can find it quite difficult to either pay attention to the lyrics or to what it is that I am writing, because they're competing for this verbal production and that is happening, and the processing in your brain is really all turned towards that verbal component, so it's impossible to distinguish. However, if you're listening to classical music, for example, and not really interested in what is being, there's no verbal content, then that has no interference. So sometimes it can really help get you into the flow of whatever it is that you are doing. Because of this, there are trends, unfortunately, especially in suggested by the Department of Education. I should not say this, but it's true. Where we're imposing children not to be, for example, moving or using their pencils when they're listening to their tutors. And that, of course, it's ridiculous. First, because it's not competing with any resource. It's a verbal input that's coming at them. It can be visual, but it does not hurt them to have a pencil or a pen in their hands. But also because it can easily be used as something that allows children to some extent, diffuse stress, relax a little bit. They're moving something. And because they're not allowed to touch their pencils, some children, for example, who might have their ears pierced, move their earrings, and to the extent that sometimes that can cause lesions because they're not allowed to be holding their pencils. Why is that? It's just, I think, taking a theory, an example that is really ridiculous, taking a theory and trying to implement it without really understanding the theory or what it means. And
that's a great example. And what I try and say to my clients in the workplace around the topic of multitasking, which is effectively what we're talking about now, I put it to them that if you're honest with yourself, you'll know if you're trying to do two complex things at the same time, one will suffer. You are not going to be paying attention to the speaker in the meeting while you're writing an email. That you'll do both badly, or you'll zone out from one completely. So the question before everyone is, does it matter if I multitask in this context? And in some contexts, it doesn't really matter at all because they're not important, really important tasks. We're effectively multitasking if we eat while we watch TV, but they're not really competing with each other. But in the workplace, there are so many inputs, so many drains on our attention that we can find ourselves in this situation where we believe it's efficient to try and do multiple things at the same time. And that's putting an extra load on us that's really not helpful and can lead to errors. And from what I've read in the literature around multitasking, it can increase our feelings of anxiety as well without us even realizing it.
Absolutely. And we see it in the lab every day. And regardless of age, regardless of neurocognitive compromise, we see it for everyone. And interestingly, I feel that some of the participants in some of the studies that we do might think at the end, oh, please make it stop, because we're asking them to do so much. For example, we might be asking them to perform a NANBAC task, where they're asked to remember the number that they've seen 2 trials before, while at the same time keeping a prospective memory intention in mind. So, but when the box surrounding the number is green, remember to press a different key. And now let's make it even harder. Let's include an auditory stimulus there, where every time, so someone is repeating letters, and every time that they say 2 vowels in a row, you'll have to press another key. And it gets to a point where it's not only complex to perform, very, very hard. And of course, from the moment we start multitasking, we immediately see in performance, especially in speed, so in reaction time, we see a decline. And that is immediate, regardless of the complexity of the task. But as you say, does it really matter if you're eating and watching TV, or you're eating slowly while you're watching TV? Doesn't matter. Or you might have, something might have escaped. Some of the, you might not have seen the entire scene because you were looking at your popcorn. I don't know.
Exactly. Well, I share this story when talking about this in workshops, about how I realized I developed a terrible habit of using my iPad while watching TV. And my partner came back into the room at one point and said, what happened? And I realized I was listening, but it's in Danish. And so I don't speak Danish. I'd missed all the subtitles while I was looking at my iPad, and I don't even remember what I was looking at. I was just caught between these 2 complex tasks. Nothing terrible happened, but it showed me even something like that. The tasks interfere with each other. The flip side, to come back to something you mentioned earlier, that's just popped into my mind, the music with lyrics versus without. I have, without even realizing it, for years, if I want to play music while doing something complex, I make sure it's music in a foreign language, because then I don't pay attention to the lyrics.
Yes.
And that's really interesting to me. Whereas I know if it was a podcast or spoken word content on the radio, it would totally take me away from what I was trying to write or read.
immediately, but also because it adds to the difficulty, it causes anxiety and frustration often because you're not performing at the level you could. And there's this illusion that it's quite interesting. We observed quite often in drivers. So people who are learning to drive tend to look at a very short distance, up to 40 meters, but usually 20 meters. While they're driving, because they have to look at so many things. They have to look at the steering wheel. They're trying to see if the car has gears. They'll look, oh, where is it? And as they develop their understanding of driving and they become more confident drivers, which happens around 1 to 2 years of starting to drive, they begin to look further away, so 100 meters, and with an average of 60 meters or so more than the double of what they were looking at before. The gaze is just much far away because there's no need to look at everything that is happening. And that's when people begin to introduce other things. Oh, if I just look at my mobile phone, it will not matter. Oh, I can even eat while driving.
Yeah.
And guess what? You really cannot.
Exactly. I ask people in a completely different way when we're talking about psychological flexibility and being able to be present in the moment. We explore the complex tasks we do in an automatic pilot way. And the number of people who report doing their driving commute and not remembering the drive is both amazing and quite scary. Because it's amazing, it's a complex task and it's unique every time you do it, in the sense the traffic is different, yet they're doing it and completely absenting themselves in a way while they think about something else, or they listen to music or the news or something, and they can't tell you how they found their parking spot or even where they've parked.
Exactly. And it's quite interesting because it doesn't happen in the first year of driving, and it begins to happen from the moment you think you're an expert. And it's quite humbling because if, like me, you had to readjust to a system where you drive in a different side of the road from the one you've learned, then you're relearning everything all over again. And for a while, for a brief period, you will remember everything because you're doing it in such an attentive manner. But then it comes back again, and it's unavoidable. We're engaged in thought, and if we are not careful, if we do not train our brain, because it's all about training, and it is a muscle. It works like a muscle. We see it in cognitive degeneration. I think that it's quite evident that if you perform activities that are stimulating and diverse again, that will help to maintain, to sustain cognitive ability for longer, even if you get to a moment where you develop Alzheimer's, for example. We know that education, for example, is considered a neuroprotective factor, but I suspect that it might be because we become experts at doing more things efficiently and sustaining a performance at a very high level for longer periods. And so it's not as evident. And for the individual, it can be quite evident, oh, something is not quite right. But actually, the evidence in performance will not be felt until later. And it's complex.
It really is. And I'm circling back to one of the first points you made, that someone's caregiver or colleague or child will notice those faults in prospective memory maybe before someone else does, or a trend in those. Yeah.
Yes. And it will be, so there are many studies, quantitative and qualitative. It's in the qualitative studies, I think, that we start to understand. It's lifting the veil. Okay, we know this happens, but why does it happen? And it's quite interesting because it's about it being meaningful, I think, and interfering in a way that can, in an extreme, be quite scary. Because we need this to be autonomous, to live an independent life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is the complexity. But everyone can benefit from training memory and from training prospective memory. And the techniques that will work will vary from person to person. But in my opinion, the simpler, the better, because you'll be able to use them with ease without having to think a lot about, oh, when I need that, and then I'll need all. And no,
Yeah.
the easier it is, the most effective it will be, because it will be more utilized, and it's so simple.
And not something that's going to interfere potentially with another task.
Exactly.
We're setting up a reminder for something. I'm reminded, and I'm conscious we need to wrap up in a moment, but I'm reminded about advances over the last couple of years in personal technology, where reminders now can be set to be location-based. Your phone will ping when you're at a certain place, or a reminder will pop up when you're messaging a certain person because you mentioned their name in a reminder somewhere. So we can really use this stuff that's in our pocket, every day. But as I find myself saying a lot, you need to read the instructions. You need to find out that it's in your phone, but it's there. And we can save ourselves a lot of anxiety, stress, and disappointment by simply making lists and keeping them close by. The visual field is a really powerful place to have this stuff. And as you pointed to, novelty or bizarreness, where it's out of place. What is that reminding me of? And experimentation with this. There's no one size fits all. I think every conversation on this podcast includes that phrase.
Yes.
But we need to think, what works for me, what's helpful, and I'll stick with that.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
What is the one thing you would love listeners to understand about prospective memory?
That's a very interesting question. I think that it is complex. And again, we go back to the point you've raised about kindness and being kind to oneself, knowing that things will happen and things will fail, and sometimes with dramatic consequences, but allowing that space to fail and knowing, okay, it happened, next time will be better. Remembering perhaps that there are things that really cannot fail, as we were talking about the surgery scenario. And when that happens, being kind to themselves again, so that they remember, okay, a list is okay here. And it will help me to perform even better and to be more professional because I'm using it effectively. So I think that one thing to remember is that it's about kindness. The other thing, I think, it's that experiment with 2-year-olds. If you really want it, if you really want that chocolate, you will do it.
Yeah.
And I think, yes.
Making it appealing. Wow.
Oh, yes.
That's a fantastic point. Listen, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great to talk with you. I'll be sharing a link back to your profile and all the other great stuff you do. And I know listeners and viewers may have questions. So by all means, you can email me, podcast@worklifepsych.com. And I probably will have to reach out to Antonina to get the answers. But it's such an interesting topic and it applies to all of us. So I'm pretty confident we'll have some questions about it. But for now, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Please do reach out. It will be my pleasure.